This is a work of complete fiction created solely for entertainment purposes. All characters, locations, organizations, and events are entirely fictional. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. He didn't stumble. He didn't hesitate. Nathaniel Vale wrapped his hand around Scarlett Royce's waist in front of 500 witnesses, tilted her back like he was the hero of his own movie, and kissed her, full and deliberate, directly beneath the spotlight he had paid $200,000 to install. The cameras flashed. The room went silent, and his wife, standing 20 feet away in a silver-white gown, set her champagne glass down on a passing tray with the steadiest hand anyone in that ballroom had ever seen. She didn't cry. She didn't move. She simply watched him with an expression nobody could quite read. Not grief, not shock. Something older and quieter than both. That image, Vivian Vale, perfectly still while her husband kissed another woman in front of the world, would be replicated on the cover of every financial magazine in the country within 72 hours. But not for the reason Nathaniel expected. If you're watching this right now, I want you to stay until the very end, because this story is going to take you somewhere you will not see coming. Hit that like button, drop a comment with the city you're watching from, and let's see just how far this story travels. The night Charleston's social season opened its doors, it opened them wide. The Meridian Grand, a restored Beaux-Arts hotel with chandeliers the size of small automobiles and a ballroom that had hosted 4 governors and 1 sitting senator, was dressed to its absolute limit. White orchids banked every surface. String quartet music drifted under conversations. Waitstaff in black moved through the crowd like chess pieces, precise and invisible. The Hartwell Children's Foundation Gala was the event of the calendar. Every year, the city's old money and new money put on their best behavior for 3 hours and gave generously to a cause that allowed them to feel clean about the rest of what they did with their time. It was theater with a tax receipt attached, and everyone knew it, and nobody said so. And that was the entire point. Vivian Hale Vale arrived alone. Her driver had dropped her at the east entrance at 7:42, which was 18 minutes after the doors opened, long enough that the room was full, not so late as to make a statement. Vivian did not make statements. That was, everyone understood, simply not her style. She was dressed in deep champagne silk, understated, impeccably cut, the kind of gown that didn't compete for attention because it didn't have to. She wore her mother's pearl earrings, a thin bracelet, and nothing else. Her dark hair was pulled back. Her posture was the kind that doesn't come from a trainer. It comes from years of understanding that a room is watching you and deciding in advance that you will give it nothing to use. She was 41 years old. She had been Nathaniel Vale's wife for 12 of them. People who knew her from the early years sometimes said they missed the version of Vivian who laughed more easily, who had opinions about art and city planning and the university's endowment policy, who once argued loudly at a dinner party that the city's waterfront development was being strangled by the same 3 developers recycling the same proposals decade after decade. That woman had been vivid and occasionally inconvenient, which Nathaniel had found charming precisely until it stopped being useful, somewhere around year 3 of the marriage. The version of Vivian who moved through the Meridian Grand on a Tuesday evening in October was quieter, elegant in the way that a closed door is elegant, composed, giving nothing away, making you wonder what's on the other side without offering any clue. She circulated. She smiled at Senator Aldridge's wife and asked after their youngest daughter's gallery show in Savannah. She told Pierce Hartwell, the foundation's director, that the auction items this year were the best she'd seen. She accepted a glass of champagne and did not drink it. She did all of this on autopilot because she had been doing it for a decade and because tonight she was paying attention to something else. Nathaniel arrived at 8:15 with the confidence of a man who understands that the room will wait for him, and the room did. At 53, Nathaniel Vale was still physically formidable, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of gray at his temples that read as distinguished rather than aged in the lighting his people specifically arranged. He shook hands hard and laughed loud and moved through a crowd the way a boat moves through water, which is to say that the water parts and the boat doesn't notice. He had built, or was widely believed to have built, a real estate empire that stretched from the Battery to the harbor, 26 properties in 6 years, deals that had genuinely transformed the city's skyline. He was the kind of man whom other men called a visionary, and whose wife they barely remembered the name of. "There she is," he said, finding Vivian near the bar. and kissed her cheek with the practiced warmth of a man who has learned exactly how much warmth is socially required. "You look lovely." "Thank you." She touched his arm. "Senator Aldridge is looking for you. Something about the waterfront variants." "I'll find him." He was already scanning the room. "Have you eaten? They're doing the seating in about 20 minutes. "I'm fine." He nodded without really hearing her and moved off. And Vivian watched him go and felt nothing in particular, which was itself a kind of information. She noticed Scarlett Royce at 8:34. Not because Scarlett was obvious, the woman was too smart for that. She arrived with 2 colleagues from Nathaniel's acquisitions team, wearing a dress the color of garnets, positioning herself in conversation with a cluster of city council members near the east windows. She wasn't looking at Nathaniel. She was specifically, carefully not looking at Nathaniel, which is a different thing entirely from simply not looking at someone. And Vivian caught the distinction the moment she saw it. Scarlett Royce was 34, a corporate strategist Nathaniel had hired 14 months ago with a compensation package that Vivian's attorney Edmund Mercer had flagged without comment when the HR filings crossed his desk. She was brilliant, by all accounts. Her restructuring of Nathaniel's acquisitions pipeline had reportedly increased deal velocity by 30%. She was also very clearly a woman who understood exactly where the power in a room was located and how to position herself in proximity to it. Vivian watched her for approximately 40 seconds. Then she returned to her champagne glass and thought about something else. She had known since the spring. Not suspected. Known. Edmund had brought her the first documentation in April, a series of hotel charges and calendar anomalies that, assembled together, told a clear and boring story. She had sat with the paperwork for 2 days before she told Edmund to continue monitoring and to proceed with the secondary legal review she had already asked him to begin 6 months before that, for reasons that had nothing to do with Scarlett Royce and everything to do with a much longer calculation. Vivian was not impulsive. She had not been impulsive since she was 27 years old and married a man who made her feel, for a year and then 2, like the most seen person in any room. She had learned, slowly, then all at once, that being seen by Nathaniel Vale was a conditional arrangement, and that the conditions shifted without notice, and that the person who got rearranged when the conditions shifted was always her. She had adapted. And then, over a number of years, she had done something else entirely. But that was not a story for this ballroom. On this evening, with the string quartet playing Vivaldi and Senator Aldridge's wife, refilling her wine glass 20 feet away. Dinner was announced at 9. The tables were round, 12 to a seat, arranged by a social geography that the Foundation's events director had spent weeks calibrating. Vivian was seated beside Pierce Hartwell and across from a developer named Creston who had been trying to get Nathaniel's attention on a Somerville project for 2 years. She ate the salmon. She drank half a glass of white wine. She listened to Creston describe the projected return on his Somerville investment with the patient attention of a woman who has heard 100 versions of this exact conversation and found something to learn in each one. At 9:47, she felt her phone vibrate twice in her small evening bag. She did not check it at the table. She excused herself graciously, touched Pierce Hartwell's arm, told him the Foundation's work this year had been extraordinary, and meant it. In the powder room off the east corridor, with its marble countertops and gold-framed mirrors, and the faint sound of music drifting under the door, Vivian opened the message from Edmund. Review complete. Final instrument executed. Ready when you are. She read it twice. She put the phone back in her bag. She looked at herself in the mirror for a moment, not vainly, not anxiously, the way a person looks at themselves when they are checking to make sure the face they're presenting to the world is still the face they intend. It was. She smoothed one side of her hair, which didn't need smoothing, and went back to the ballroom. At the table, Nathaniel was telling a story about a Tokyo deal that had almost collapsed over a translation error, and the table was laughing, and Scarlett Royce was 2 tables away with her colleagues, laughing at something else. And their eyes met for exactly the length of time that plausible deniability requires before they both looked away. Vivian watched this and said nothing. After dinner came the auction. A private island week, a restored sailboat, 2 paintings by a local artist whose prices had climbed significantly since last year. Nathaniel bid competitively on a wine collection, won it, accepted congratulations. He was good at this. The sport of it, the performance. She had once found it genuinely enjoyable to watch. At 11, when the formal program ended and the room loosened into cocktail conversations and people began drifting toward the exit, Vivian found Nathaniel near the bar. "I think I'll head home," she said. He checked his watch. "I'll be another hour. The car can take you." "Of course." She picked up the wrap she'd left on a nearby chair. "Don't forget you have the architects at 8. "I know." He was looking past her. "I'll be quiet when I come in." She turned to leave and nearly walked directly into Scarlett Royce, who had materialized with the drink refill precision of a woman who has been tracking the geography of a conversation from across the room. "Mrs. Vale." Scarlett's smile was the kind that offers nothing and wants everything. "Lovely to finally meet you properly. Nathaniel talks about you all the time." Vivian looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time up close. Scarlett was beautiful in a highly engineered way, the kind of beauty that announces itself and then waits for you to confirm it. Her eyes were sharp and intelligent and currently engaged in a very specific kind of social combat that she had decided was already won. "He doesn't, actually," Vivian said pleasantly. "But that's very kind of you to say." The smile flickered, just for a moment. "Well," Scarlett said, "I hope we can—" "Good night," Vivian said, and walked away. In the car heading back across the city, the lights of Charleston sliding past the window in long, amber streaks, Vivian Hale Vale sat with her hands in her lap and watched the skyline she had known her entire life. The buildings stood where they had always stood. The harbor was the same harbor, but some things, she thought, were about to be very different. Her phone buzzed again. This one was a forward from Edmund, a financial summary, a set of corporate documents, a timeline laid out in clean columns. She scrolled through it slowly, reading what she had already read a dozen times, because some things deserve to be read one more time before they become real. Her father, Leonard Hale, had built Hale Dominion Group across 40 years of decisions nobody outside his private offices had ever fully understood. He had understood, before he died, what his daughter's marriage would eventually require, and he had built accordingly. The prenuptial agreement Nathaniel had insisted on, proudly, in front of attorneys on both sides, as though generosity required an audience, had protected exactly what it was designed to protect. The assets Nathaniel believed were his. It had said nothing, because there was nothing to say, about assets that had never been his at all. Vivian set the phone face down on the seat beside her. Outside, the city moved past, ordinary and indifferent, the way cities are when they don't yet know what's coming. She was not a woman who celebrated in advance. She was not a woman given to satisfaction before a thing was finished. But in the quiet of the car, with the partition up and the driver navigating the familiar route home, she allowed herself one small, specific feeling. Not triumph, not anger, not even relief. Just the particular calm of a person who has been patient for a very long time and can see at last that the patience is nearly over. The invitation had gone out 6 weeks in advance, printed on heavy cream cardstock with Nathaniel Vale's initials embossed in charcoal gray at the top, and the language of it had been chosen with the particular care of a man who understands that words are also a form of architecture. An evening of vision was what it called itself, a celebration of the future of Charleston, a chance for the city's most consequential minds to witness the unveiling of what would become, in Nathaniel's careful phrasing, his greatest contribution to the skyline he loved. The skyline he had built, the invitation implied. The skyline that bore his fingerprints on every glass tower and converted warehouse and waterfront development from the Battery to the Upper Harbor. Nathaniel Vale, self-made visionary, architect of modern Charleston, presenting the crown jewel of a career defined by ambition and intelligence and the kind of relentless drive that ordinary men admired from a distance because they couldn't locate it in themselves. That was the story the invitation told. It was a very good story. Nathaniel had been telling it for years, and it had the smooth, frictionless quality of a narrative that has been repeated often enough to stop feeling like a narrative and start feeling like fact. Vivian received her copy of the invitation on the kitchen counter with the rest of the week's correspondence. She read it once, set it down, and went to make coffee. The gala was 14 days after the foundation event, 2 weeks in which Charleston's social machinery had been quietly humming with anticipation. The guest list alone was the subject of 3 separate items in the city's lifestyle press, which named sitting politicians, two visiting tech billionaires, a former Treasury official, and the editorial board of the Southeast's most widely read financial journal. Nathaniel had made sure of all of it. He had a publicist who was very good at her job, and he paid her accordingly, and the resulting coverage read like the prelude to something genuinely historic. In those 2 weeks, Vivian went about her life. She had breakfast with Edmund Mercer on the Thursday before the gala. Not at his offices, which was where they met when the conversation was strictly transactional, but at a small restaurant on a side street in Harleston Village that neither of them had any particular public association with. Edmund was 61, compact and gray-haired, with reading glasses he kept in his breast pocket, and the kind of precise, economical speaking style that comes from 40 years of knowing that words in his profession have specific weights. He ordered black coffee and dry wheat toast, which was what he always ordered, and spread his small leather notebook on the table between them without ceremony. "The secondary review is complete," he said. "All instruments are properly executed and filed. The trust documentation is clean. The waterfall mechanism activates the moment you trigger the primary protocol." He paused. "Everything is exactly where it needs to be." Vivian wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "And the timing?" "Your discretion. Could be tomorrow. Could be 6 months from now." He looked at her over his glasses. "Though I would note that certain atmospherics may be approaching a natural point of clarity." She understood what he meant. "The gala." "He's planning something," Edmund said. It wasn't a question. "The level of press staging for this event is beyond what a standard project unveiling requires. He wants an audience for something." "He always wants an audience," Vivian said. "That's not new." "No," Edmund agreed. "But the scale is—" He lifted his coffee. "I want to make sure you've considered all contingencies for the 48 hours following activation. There will be a period of disruption." "I know. Some of that disruption will be public." "I know, Edmund." He nodded and let it go because in 30 years of working for the Hale family, he had learned that when Vivian Hale said she knew something, she had generally known it for considerably longer than the conversation suggested. He flipped a page in his notebook and moved on to the procedural specifics, and Vivian listened and asked 3 precise questions and drank her coffee. And by the time they left the restaurant, the morning was still young, and the street outside was entirely ordinary, and nothing about the two of them, to any passing observer, would have indicated that anything of consequence had been discussed at all. The night of the gala, Vivian took her time. She had given her housekeeper the evening off and dressed alone, which she preferred for occasions when she needed to think. The gown she'd chosen was silver white, a color she rarely wore, with a structured bodice and a skirt that moved cleanly when she walked. It was not subtle. She had chosen it deliberately, and she knew exactly what it would do to a room, and to Nathaniel specifically, and she had made her peace with that. She pinned her mother's brooch at the collar, not the pearls she'd worn 2 weeks ago, but a small Art Deco piece in white gold and sapphire that had belonged to her grandmother before her mother. She stood at the full-length mirror in the dressing room for a moment, taking stock. She looked, she thought, like herself, maybe more than she had in a long time. The Harrington Center was a glass and steel event space on the harbor. 4 floors with the top 2 opened onto an outdoor terrace that looked directly at the water, and beyond it, the cluster of cranes and framework that marked the current construction site of Nathaniel's flagship project, the billion-dollar mixed-use development he'd announced 2 years ago, with the kind of press conference that required a stage and a rendering the size of a barn door. Tonight, the building's exterior was lit in corporate blue, and a red carpet had been arranged at the entrance, which was perhaps a degree beyond what most real estate announcements required. But Nathaniel had never been troubled by excess. Vivian arrived at 8 o'clock exactly. The moment she stepped through the entrance, she felt the room shift. It was a small thing, a half-second recalibration of attention, conversations pausing and restarting, heads turning in the particular involuntary way they do when something unexpected arrives. She didn't pause to acknowledge it. She moved into the room with the unhurried directness of a woman who has somewhere specific to be, accepted a glass of champagne from a passing tray, and found a position near the center of the space where she could see the full room without appearing to survey it. She was aware of Nathaniel noticing her from across the room. She was aware of the exact moment his expression changed. Pleasure to assessment to something more complicated. The particular recalibration of a man who had convinced himself his wife was background, and has been reminded without warning that she is not. He excused himself from the conversation he was in and came toward her, and she waited. "Vivian." He stopped 2 feet away and looked at her the way he used to look at her 12 years ago, which was a complicated thing to witness. That's a new dress." "It is. You should wear white more." He seemed genuinely caught off balance, which almost never happened in public, and he didn't like the feeling. "When did you—" "Edmund sends his regards," she said. "He's sorry he couldn't be here tonight." A flicker of something. Nathaniel had never been entirely comfortable with Edmund Mercer, without ever being able to articulate why. "How is Edmund?" "Extremely well. Very focused on work." She smiled. "You should circulate. Senator Briggs is near the bar, and he looks like he wants to talk about the waterfront variants again." Nathaniel looked at her for a moment longer than was natural, the way a person looks at something they're trying to solve. Then a photographer appeared at his elbow, and he turned automatically, shoulders back, smile on, and the moment dissolved. Vivian watched him go. She moved through the evening with the same unhurried attention she'd brought to the Foundation Gala 2 weeks before, and if anything, she was more relaxed because she had, by this point, made all the decisions that needed making, and what remained was simply to be present for whatever came next. She spoke with Foster Aldridge, the city council member who had been on the fence about the waterfront variants for 8 months, and she listened carefully to his actual concerns, which were less about the variance itself than about a pedestrian access corridor that Nathaniel's team had apparently been dismissive of in their last meeting. She stored the information. She spoke with a journalist named Priya Voss from the Financial Ledger, who covered commercial real estate and was sharp and direct, and asked Vivian twice, with varying degrees of indirection, whether she had thoughts on the long-term governance structure of Vail Properties. Vivian gave her a smile and a non-answer and liked her immediately. She noticed Scarlett Royce at 8:45, near the stage setup at the north end of the room, dressed in a deep burgundy that was clearly not accidental, standing at the precise angle to the stage lights that suggested she had, at some prior point, stood in this exact spot and checked. They did not speak. Scarlett looked at her once, a longer look than at the Foundation Gala, with something different in it, not the competitive glitter of 2 weeks ago, but something that might, in a different context, have been read as appraisal. Vivian held her gaze for a moment and then let it go. At 9:15, the lights in the main room shifted, and the crowd turned toward the stage. The presentation was polished to the point of excess. A 7-minute video, produced at what Vivian's eye estimated was significant cost, played across 3 screens simultaneously, showing the city's skyline transforming in time-lapse, buildings rising, light moving across water, a narrated sequence about vision and legacy and the responsibility of builders to the communities they shape. It was well made. The production company Nathaniel used was very good at this particular genre of corporate self-mythology. When the video ended, Nathaniel stepped onto the stage. He was, Vivian would privately acknowledge, a very effective public speaker. He understood the pause, the dropped register, the specific art of making 500 people feel simultaneously like they were part of something historic and like he was speaking directly to each of them individually. He had been doing it long enough that it no longer looked like performance. He talked about the city. He talked about the 12-year journey from a single renovation project in the Cannonboro neighborhood to the 40-story mixed-use development that was going to redefine Charleston's relationship with its own waterfront. He named the project the Meridian Development, and the screens filled with renderings of towers and parks and a public promenade along the harbor edge. The room responded with the sound of people who are impressed and want to be seen being impressed. He talked about his team, which was expected, and named several people by name, and each one received applause. And this went on for a minute and a half in a way that was socially comfortable and entirely unremarkable. And then he paused. It was a specific pause, one Vivian had not heard before. Not the performer's pause for effect, but something rougher under it. She watched him from 40 feet away and felt, in the space between one breath and the next, a change in the temperature of the moment, though she could not have said exactly what it was. "There's one person," Nathaniel said, "who has been at the center of this project from the beginning, someone without whom," and his voice carried something real now, unscripted, which was almost more unsettling than the performance. "This vision would not exist." In the crowd, Vivian did not move. He turned his head. He found Scarlett Royce in the room. He reached his hand toward her. What happened next took perhaps 4 seconds. Scarlett came forward. She had been positioned for it. That was clear, in retrospect. The way she moved toward the stage with no hesitation, no social performance of surprise, because she had known this was coming, and had chosen her dress and her position in the room accordingly. She climbed the 2 steps to the stage, and Nathaniel took her hand, and the room watched, still unclear on what they were witnessing. And then Nathaniel Vale, in front of 500 people, with 3 cameras trained on the stage, and a journalist from the Financial Ledger standing 12 feet from Vivian's left shoulder, pulled Scarlett Royce toward him and kissed her. Not a social kiss, not an ambiguous thing that could be explained away in the morning. He kissed her the way a man kisses a woman when he has decided in some fundamental interior way that he is done pretending. His hand was at her waist, the cameras flashed. The room made a sound that wasn't quite a gasp and wasn't quite silence. It was the specific sound of 500 people simultaneously recalibrating their understanding of what they were watching. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds. It felt, to the people in that room, considerably longer. When they separated, Scarlett's expression was the expression of a woman who has won something, which was a feeling she was accustomed to and wore comfortably. Nathaniel looked out at the room with the faintly dazed expression of a man who has done something irreversible and is just beginning to understand the full dimensions of that fact. His eyes found Vivian. It seemed involuntary. She was standing exactly where she had been standing. She had not moved, had not shifted, had not done any of the things that the room had braced for. No visible response, no broken composure, no caught breath. She looked at him with an expression that was not anger and was not grief and was not shock. Because she was none of those things, and she had known him long enough to know that he would eventually, one way or another, find a way to do this. And she had accounted for it, and the accounting was complete. She reached for the champagne glass on the tray of a passing server. She took one deliberate sip. She set it back down. Then she turned and walked at an entirely normal pace toward the exit. The room parted for her. People stepped aside without quite meaning to, the way crowds respond to a particular quality of purposefulness that doesn't look like urgency and doesn't look like retreat, and looks like nothing they have an easy word for. Priya Voss from the Financial Ledger was watching her. Foster Aldridge was watching her. At least 2 photographers had swung their lenses from the stage to follow her across the floor. She did not look back. The night air outside the Harrington Center came off the harbor with a clean September edge to it. Vivian stood at the top of the entrance steps and took one breath, and it was a breath that carried more weight than most of the breaths she'd taken in the last several years, but she took it evenly, the same way she did everything, because this was not the moment to stop being who she was. Her car was waiting at the bottom of the steps. Her driver, Marcus, saw her coming and had the door open before she reached the last step, which he always did, and which she had always appreciated without commenting on. She got in. The door closed. The city outside the window was its ordinary evening self. Traffic, lights, the smell of the harbor, a late restaurant still busy on the corner. Her phone was already ringing. She looked at the screen. Edmund. She answered. I saw the coverage, he said. No preamble. It's already on 2 news feeds. I know. A pause. Are you all right? Vivian leaned back against the seat. Outside, a couple was arguing good-naturedly on the sidewalk about which direction to walk, and one of them was laughing despite themselves, and the light was amber and ordinary, and the city was exactly the same city it had been 3 hours ago. Edmund, she said, how early can we meet tomorrow morning? Another pause. I can be at the office by 6. 6:30, she said, and bring everything. She ended the call and put the phone in her bag and looked out at the city she had grown up in, the city her father had quietly shaped for 40 years from an office nobody famous had ever written about, the city that was about to learn something about itself that it did not yet know. Nathaniel was still on that stage, or he had stepped off it by now. Either way, the cameras had what they needed. The story was already written. The version of it that the press would run in the morning, billionaire's very public moment, gala scandal, the kiss that stopped the room, would make him, by tomorrow afternoon, the most discussed man in the Southeast financial community. He would enjoy that, Vivian thought, at least for the first 48 hours. She watched the city move past the window and said nothing more. Marcus drove her home through streets that were quiet now, the kind of quiet a city makes when it is settling into itself for the night, not knowing what the morning will bring. At some point between the harbor and the house, she closed her eyes. Not to sleep. She was nowhere near sleep. But because there are moments when the most useful thing a person can do is stop looking outward and let the interior settle into its proper arrangement. She thought about her father. She thought about the document she had signed in his office at the age of 24, the year before she met Nathaniel, when Leonard Hale had explained to her with characteristic plainness the nature of the structure he was building and the logic of why it had to be built the way it was, and what it would mean someday, and what he hoped it would never be necessary for, and why he was doing it anyway. A foundation doesn't advertise itself, he had told her, which was something her father said about most important things. It just holds. She thought about the look on Nathaniel's face when he found her eyes across that ballroom, the specific expression of a man who has, in one impulsive, grandiose, deeply foolish moment, detonated something he cannot reassemble. She did not feel satisfaction at the memory. She did not feel much of anything yet, not cleanly, because the feelings that come with the end of 12 years are not clean feelings, and she did not intend to simplify them into something they weren't. She had loved him. That was the part that didn't simplify. 12 years ago, she had loved him with the particular, specific, undefended love of a woman who had decided deliberately to trust someone with the interior life she did not show to strangers. The fact that this trust had been received carelessly had been treated as a convenience that could be set aside when a more convenient arrangement presented itself. That was a grief she had already lived through in a sequence of smaller devastations that most people had never seen and that she had never narrated to anyone except, obliquely, Edmund, who had the discretion to file it in the appropriate place in the private architecture of what he knew. But love, even when it is gone, leaves its own particular imprint. She knew that. She had accounted for that too. The car pulled through the gate and into the long driveway. The house was lit, sensor lights coming on one by one as they rolled toward the portico, familiar and orderly. She had lived here for 9 years. It was a beautiful house. It had never, she thought, entirely felt like hers. That would be changing. Marcus opened the door and she stepped out and said goodnight to him and walked into her home, and she did not cry. Not that night. And not because she was made of stone, but because she had already given this particular grief its proper time. In private. In the months when she understood what was coming and allowed herself to feel the full weight of it before she was required to act. By the time a thing reaches its ending, you have either done your grieving or you haven't, and Vivian had. She went upstairs. She changed out of the silver-white dress with the efficiency of a woman with somewhere to be at 6:30 in the morning. She hung it carefully. Not discarded, not flung, but hung, because it had done what it was meant to do. And she washed her face and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark house and listened to the harbor wind come in off the water. Somewhere across the city, in whatever suite or restaurant or bar Nathaniel had retreated to with Scarlett after the cameras finally lowered, he would be drinking something expensive and telling himself the story of the evening in the version that made it feel like courage. She knew him well enough to know that. He would be constructing the narrative already. The liberation, the authenticity, the decision to finally stop pretending. Scarlett would be listening with the sharp, patient attention of a woman who understands that a man rewriting his own story is a man in the most suggestible state he will ever be in. Let them have the night, Vivian thought. They had earned exactly that. In the morning, everything would begin. She lay down in the dark and closed her eyes, and the house settled around her in its familiar way. And the harbor wind moved through the old live oaks in the yard, and after a while, despite everything, she slept. Edmund Mercer's office occupied the 4th floor of a narrow building on Broad Street that had been in continuous use as legal chambers since 1887, a fact he neither advertised nor apologized for. The wood in the staircase had gone dark with age. The windows were single-pane and rattled in heavy wind. The carpet in the main corridor had been replaced twice in 40 years, most recently in 2009, and showed the specific wear pattern of a place where serious people walked with purpose and didn't linger. Edmund had inherited the space from his predecessor, who had inherited it from his, and he had never once considered moving to the glass tower offices that the newer firms occupied on Meeting Street, because Edmund Mercer was not a man who confused the appearance of consequence with the actual thing. Vivian arrived at 6:28. She had been awake since 4:30. Not the restless, grinding wakefulness of anxiety, but the particular early morning clarity that comes when a decision has been completely made and the only thing remaining is execution. She had made coffee. She had sat at the kitchen table for 40 minutes in the quiet house and gone through every document in the leather portfolio she kept in the locked drawer of her home office. Not because she needed to review them, but because it was the kind of morning that deserved that particular ritual of confirmation. Everything she had prepared over the course of 3 years was in order. It had been in order for months, but she looked at it anyway. She dressed without ceremony. Dark trousers, a charcoal blouse, flat shoes. No jewelry except the watch her father had given her on her 35th birthday. A plain, serious timepiece that he had worn for 20 years before passing it to her. She had not worn it to either gala. It was not a gala watch. It was a work watch. And this was a work morning. Marcus was waiting at 6:10 without being asked, which told her he had been following the news. Edmund opened the office door himself before she reached the top of the stairs. "Coffee's on," he said. "Thank you for coming in early." "I was already awake." He stepped aside to let her pass, and she entered the main conference room. A long table, the original plaster ceiling, windows that looked out over Broad Street's early morning emptiness. And he closed the door behind them both. The table was already covered. Edmund had been in this office since before 5 o'clock, by the look of it. The documents were arranged in their proper sequence. Corporate registry filings, the trust instruments, the Hale Dominion Group board resolutions, the chain of title documentation for every significant asset that bore Nathaniel Vale's name in any public capacity. Beside them, separated by a clean margin, was a single manila folder containing the activation protocol, the specific sequence of legal and corporate actions that, once initiated, would move like a tide through the entire structure of what the world currently understood to be Nathaniel's empire. Vivian sat down. Edmund poured coffee and sat across from her, notebook open, pen uncapped. "The financial ledger ran it at midnight," he said. "Front page of the digital edition. Priyavas had the story up within 2 hours of the event." "I know. I read it. It's been picked up by 4 other outlets as of 6 a.m. By noon it will be national." He paused. His publicist issued a statement at 2 in the morning. Very brief. Personal matter, private family business, no further comment. Vivian thought about the publicist, a competent woman named Dana Schreier, who had been managing Nathaniel's press for 6 years and who was, by this point, probably drinking something stronger than coffee. "That won't hold the day." "No," Edmund agreed. "It won't." She set both hands flat on the table. "Then let's not waste the morning." What followed was 3 hours of the most precise, methodical work Vivian had done in years, though it looked to anyone observing like nothing more than 2 people going through paperwork. Edmund walked her through each instrument in sequence, confirming execution status, verifying filing dates, cross-referencing the corporate board resolutions against the current officer registry at Hale Dominion Group. They spoke in the shorthand of people who have been working toward a specific end for a long time and do not need to explain to each other why each step matters. The structure was this. Leonard Hale had founded Hale Dominion Group in 1976 as a private holding corporation, the apex entity of a financial architecture that, over 4 decades, had quietly accumulated ownership positions in real estate, infrastructure, and commercial development across the Southeast. He had done this without fanfare, without press, without the kind of public profile that attracts scrutiny, because Leonard Hale had understood something that most builders never learn, that the most durable power is the kind nobody is looking at. When Vivian's mother died, when Vivian was 19, Leonard had begun the process of restructuring the trust that would eventually convey Hale Dominion Group to his daughter. It had taken him 7 years to do it properly. He had not been in a hurry. He had wanted the structure to be clean and unassailable, and he had employed Edmund's predecessor, and then Edmund himself to ensure that it was. Vivian had been 24 when the primary trust instruments were executed, 26 when the full beneficial ownership transferred. She had been in Edmund's office, in this same building, on a gray January afternoon, signing documents in a sequence that took 2 hours, and Leonard had sat beside her the entire time, not speaking much, watching her sign each page with the expression of a man who is completing something he began when she was a child and feels the weight of that completion more than he expected. He had died 14 months later. Pancreatic cancer, fast, and he had known it was coming for almost a year before Vivian knew. And he had used that year to make sure every element of the structure was exactly as it needed to be. She had not sold a single asset. She had not altered the structure he built. She had allowed Hale Dominion Group to continue its quiet operation, managed by a small, extremely competent team led by a CFO named Harriet Osei, who had been with the company for 19 years and whose discretion was absolute, while the public face of Vivian Hale became, by degrees, the background figure in her husband's story. Now she was watching Edmund's pen move down the activation checklist. "Board notification goes out at 9, he said. "Harriet will convene an emergency session at 10. The officer change filings will be submitted to the state registry by 11, which makes them effective as of close of business today." He turned a page. The notification to Vail Properties lenders goes out simultaneously with the officer change. Under the credit agreement, any change in beneficial ownership of the primary holding entity triggers an automatic review and interim freeze on all operating accounts, pending confirmation of new authorized signatories. Which means his access cards stop working. His access cards, his corporate accounts, his authorized signatory status on every instrument held by an entity in which Hale Dominion Group holds a controlling interest. Edmund looked at her. "Which is all of them." Vivian was quiet for a moment. She knew this. She had always known this. The knowing did not make the hearing of it light. "And the prenup?" she said, though she also knew the answer. Edmund permitted himself a brief expression that was as close as he came to satisfaction. "The prenuptial agreement Nathaniel executed protects assets in which he holds beneficial ownership. It says nothing, because there was nothing to say, about assets held in trust by Hale Dominion Group, in which he has never held any ownership interest of any kind." He set down his pen. "He was never a partner, Vivian. He was an employee with a very good title and a very expensive lifestyle. The prenup protects his personal assets, of which there are some. It does not touch the empire, because the empire was never his to begin with." The words sat in the air of the old conference room. Outside on Broad Street, the city was beginning its morning, the sound of it drifting up through the single-pane windows. A delivery truck. A car alarm 3 blocks away, silencing itself. Ordinary city sounds that had nothing to do with what was happening in this room. Vivian picked up her coffee cup. It was cold. She drank it anyway. "All right," she said. "Let's proceed." At 9:03, the notification went to the Hale Dominion Group board. At 9:47, Nathaniel Vail's assistant, a young man named Greg, who had worked for him for 2 years, and who would later describe this morning to his friends as the single most surreal professional experience of his life, called Edmund's office to ask whether there was a technical issue with the building's access system because Mr. Vail's credentials were not functioning at the headquarters entrance, and the security desk was saying they had no authority to override the lockout. Edmund's paralegal took the call and told Greg, politely, that any inquiries regarding access or operational matters should be directed to Hale Dominion Group's legal department, and provided a number that went to a dedicated line Edmund had established for exactly this purpose. Greg called the number. He was told that the matter was under active legal review and that Mr. Vail would be receiving formal correspondence at his personal address before end of business. Greg, who was 26 and had been hoping this job would last at least another year, took a breath and called Nathaniel. Nathaniel had been awake since 7. He was at the Harbor View suite of the Harrington Hotel, the same building where the gala had been held, which had a certain grim irony to it. Still in last night's shirt, his jacket over a chair, a half-eaten room service breakfast on the table beside his phone, which had been producing a continuous stream of messages since midnight ranging from the concerned to the explicitly furious. He had not called Vivian. He had been, on some level, waiting for her to call him, which was the kind of expectation that reveals more about a man's operating assumptions than almost anything else. When Greg's call came through with the news about the access credentials, Nathaniel went very still. "What do you mean the credentials aren't working?" "I mean your keycard isn't opening the building, and your executive elevator code isn't working either, and when I called the legal department number, they told me," "Which legal department?" "My legal department is Harriman Walsh." "It was a different number. They said..." Greg consulted his notepad. "They said inquiries should go to Hale Dominion Group's legal counsel." Nathaniel did not immediately respond. There was a silence on the line that Greg would later describe as unlike any silence he had ever heard from his boss, who was not a man who went quiet. "Greg," he said finally, "call Harriman and Walsh right now. Tell them I need Vance Patterson on the phone in the next 15 minutes. He ended the call and sat down on the edge of the unmade hotel bed, and for the first time since the gala, the performance fell away completely. Not the composed, calculating Nathaniel who had been constructing explanations in his head since midnight, the real one, underneath. The one who had never, in 12 years, thought seriously about what Vivian's father had actually built, or what it might mean that the woman he had legally married into it had been very, very quietly not talking about it for a very long time. Scarlett came out of the bathroom in a hotel robe and stopped when she saw his face. "What happened?" He looked up at her. "My building access isn't working." She frowned. "What? How? Did someone—" "Hail Dominion Group," he said. The words came out slowly, like he was tasting something he couldn't identify. Scarlett was still for a moment. Then something moved across her face. Not fear yet, but the early shadow of it. "What does Hail Dominion have to do with your access credentials?" "I don't know." He reached for his phone again. "But I'm going to find out in the next 20 minutes. He didn't find out in 20 minutes. He found out in 2 hours, and the finding out was the kind of experience that restructures a person's understanding of their own life so fundamentally and so rapidly that the mind keeps cycling back to recheck it, unable to accept on the first or second or fifth pass that the map it has been using is simply and completely wrong. Vance Patterson, Nathaniel's senior attorney at Harriman Walsh, was a careful, methodical man who did not traffic in alarm. He called back within 12 minutes, listened to Nathaniel's account of the morning, asked 3 questions, and then asked Nathaniel to give him 45 minutes to review certain documents before they spoke further. The 45 minutes became an hour and 10. When Patterson called back, his voice had the careful, leveled quality of a man delivering information that he wishes he did not have to deliver. "I've reviewed the Hail Dominion Group corporate registry filings and the relevant trust instruments," Patterson said. "Nathaniel, I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to think carefully before you answer. In your marriage, did you ever receive or review documentation from Leonard Hale's estate regarding the beneficial ownership structure of Hail Dominion Group?" "I knew he left her the company," Nathaniel said. "She told me she had a trust from her father. I assumed it was—" He stopped. "I assumed it was what it sounded like." "It is what it sounds like," Patterson said carefully, "but what it sounds like is considerably larger than I believe you understood it to be." The full picture came in pieces. Patterson laid them out with the particular care of a doctor delivering a diagnosis to a patient who will need to absorb it in stages rather than all at once. Hail Dominion Group was not a trust fund. It was not a passive inheritance vehicle. It was a fully operational holding corporation with controlling interests in 23 commercial properties in the Charleston metropolitan area, 11 of which bore Nathaniel's name in every public document, press release, and investor presentation he had made in the last 7 years. The financing structures behind the Meridian development, the flagship project he had unveiled to 500 people last night as the crowning achievement of his career, ran entirely through Hail Dominion subsidiary entities. The equity, the debt, guarantee, the land title, all of it. "You were the operating CEO," Patterson said, "not the owner." The corporate structure made that clear in the internal documents, but the external presentation— "I didn't know," Nathaniel said. A pause. "Did you not read the financing agreements?" Another silence, longer. He had read the financing agreements. He had read portions of them. He had trusted his own team to summarize the relevant sections, which was what he always did with documents of that density, which had never before been a problem because he had never before had reason to look at who was actually on the other side of the financing. "Vivian structured this," he said. "It was not a question. Vivian is the beneficial owner of the entity that has controlled the majority of your operational real estate portfolio since, according to these records, the year before your marriage." Nathaniel stood up from the bed. He walked to the window of the hotel suite. The harbor was out there, and the cranes, and the framework of the Meridian development standing against the morning sky, and it looked exactly as it had always looked, and it was not what he had always believed it was, and the gap between those two things was so large that standing at the edge of it felt physically destabilizing. "She planned this," he said. The anger was coming now, replacing the shock the way a second wave replaces the first, carrying different debris. She planned this from the beginning. I can't speak to intent, Patterson said. What I can tell you is that the structure predates your marriage, which means the prenup protects nothing. A very careful pause. The prenup protects your personal assets, of which there are some. Your personal accounts, the Kiowa property, certain personal investments, but the corporate portfolio, the development pipeline, the company infrastructure and brand, those flow through Hale Dominion, and as of this morning, the authorized signatory on every relevant account and the listed officer of record is no longer you. Nathaniel's hand tightened on the phone. Who is it? Vivian Hale, Patterson said. As of 9 a.m. this morning. Back on Broad Street, Edmund's office had settled into a different rhythm. The urgent work of the morning was done. The filings were submitted, the notifications were sent. The machinery was running now, the way properly built machinery runs, quietly, steadily, without requiring intervention. Edmund was on a call with Harriet Osei at Hale Dominion Group, going through the operational transition details, when his assistant knocked and opened the conference room door. Vivian looked up from the document she was reviewing. Mr. Vale is downstairs, the assistant said. She was a young woman named Clara who had worked for Edmund for 3 years and had the composure of someone twice her age. He doesn't have an appointment. He's somewhat agitated. Edmund's eyebrows rose fractionally. He said a quiet word into his phone and lowered it. Vivian set down her document. Is Marcus outside? Yes. Tell him to stay with the car. She looked at Edmund. I'll go down. Edmund stood up. Vivian, he's not dangerous, she said. He's just furious. There's a difference. She straightened her jacket. Give me 10 minutes. She walked down the narrow staircase and through the building's small lobby and opened the front door onto Broad Street. Nathaniel was standing on the sidewalk. He was still in last night's clothes, the dress shirt now open at the collar, no jacket, which was so unlike his normal presentation that it was itself a kind of information. He had the look of a man who has been awake all night and spent the last several hours rebuilding his face into something that conveys authority, without quite managing it. We need to talk, he said. We can talk, Vivian said. She came down the 2 front steps and stopped at the bottom, which put them at approximately the same level. Right here is fine. He looked at the street around them, as though a public sidewalk was an indignity he hadn't anticipated. Vivian, what I've done, she said, keeping her voice even, is activate a corporate governance structure that my father built and that I have legally owned for 15 years. You let me believe, I never told you I owned nothing, she said. You assumed it. You assumed it the same way you assumed most things about me, which was without asking, and without particularly caring about the answer. He stared at her. There was something raw and genuine in his face now, underneath the fury. Not quite remorse, not quite shame, but the specific bewilderment of a man who has been confidently narrating his own story for 20 years and has just learned that a significant portion of the narration was wrong. The Meridian, he said. Tell me that wasn't... It was. She kept her voice even. The financing structure on the Meridian runs through 3 Hale Dominion subsidiaries. I approved the initial equity position in 2019. The deal you announced last night exists because my company funded it from the first. He went quiet in a way that was different from the earlier quiet. This was not calculation. This was a man hitting the actual bottom of something. Why? He said. Why let it go this long? Why not? Because I wanted to give you every possible opportunity to be a different person than you turned out to be. The words came out without heat, which made them land harder than if she'd shouted them. I am not a person who acts carelessly, Nathaniel. I spent 12 years watching and waiting and hoping I was wrong about what I was watching. She paused. I wasn't wrong. He looked at her for a long moment. A city bus went past on the street. A couple walked by with a dog, not noticing them, the city indifferent in the way only cities can be. And now, he said, now you'll receive formal correspondence from Edmund's office before end of business today. You have personal assets. Vance Patterson can help you understand what they are. The Kiowa property is yours. Your personal accounts are untouched. She kept her eyes on him. I'm not trying to leave you with nothing. I'm trying to leave you with exactly what was yours. It is a smaller number than you believed it was. I'm sorry that it's a surprise. The last sentence was not sarcasm. It was, improbably, a genuine thing. The specific sorrow of a person who has watched a man spend years celebrating achievements that were partly illusion and cannot even now feel entirely clean about the undeceiving. Scarlet, he said. The word came out almost involuntarily as though he was thinking aloud. That is your business, Vivian said, not mine. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. There was nothing, she could see, that he had available to say that would accomplish what he wanted it to accomplish. The arguments he had been rehearsing in the hotel room, the legal angles Patterson had outlined, the emotional leverage he had spent the night cataloging, all of it ran up against the same wall, which was that the structure was clean and the documentation was ironclad, and the woman standing in front of him on Broad Street had been, from the very beginning, the only person in this marriage who actually knew what they were doing. He turned and walked back to the car that was idling at the curb. A car, she noticed, from a hire company rather than his usual service, because his accounts were frozen. He didn't look back at her. She stood on the sidewalk and watched him go and felt the full complicated weight of the moment, which was not triumph, not satisfaction, not relief in any simple form, but something older and quieter than all of them. The particular feeling of a thing that has been true for a very long time finally becoming visible. She went back upstairs. Edmund was standing in the doorway of the conference room, and he looked at her with the expression of a man who wants to ask and has decided not to. Get Harriet on the phone, Vivian said. I want to go through the staffing transition before noon. Edmund reached for his phone. How did it go? Vivian sat down at the long table and pulled the next document toward her. He heard it, she said. That's enough for now. By noon, the story had broken nationally. The Financial Ledger published Priya Voss's second piece at 11:45, this one with full sourcing from the corporate registry filings, the title of which, The Invisible Billionaire, How Vivian Hale Built an Empire. Her husband thought was his, was picked up, reposted, and shared more than 40,000 times before the afternoon was over. By 3 o'clock, it was on the front page of every major financial news site in the country. By 5, it had found its way to international outlets in London and Singapore, where the corporate governance angle played nearly as large as the personal drama. The story that the press had expected, betrayed wife, humiliated at gala, retreats quietly, had not materialized. What materialized instead was something that financial journalists, who are accustomed to covering people who live large and collapse loudly, did not often encounter. A woman who had, with absolute patience and without a single public statement, orchestrated the most complete corporate reversion in the history of South Carolina commercial real estate. Nathaniel gave no comment. His publicist, Dana Schreier, resigned at 2:15, sending a brief email to his personal account and a longer, more candid 1 to 3 of her professional contacts that made its way to Priya Voss's inbox before dinner. Scarlett Royce issued a statement through her own attorney, a single paragraph asserting that she had no knowledge of any corporate structure and had acted in good faith throughout her employment. It was the kind of statement that is issued when an attorney has read the documentation and advised their client quietly and with professional firmness that the documentation is bad. At Vail Properties headquarters, a building whose lobby directory had carried Nathaniel's name in brushed steel lettering at eye level for 7 years, the afternoon was a study in institutional disorientation. Employees who had come to work that morning in the ordinary way found that the executive floor was inaccessible, that the company's external communications had been frozen pending new authorized signatory verification, and that the HR director had received a formal transition notice from Hale Dominion Group's legal department that had been anticipated, apparently, by every member of the leadership team except the people who sat in the large corner offices upstairs. Harriet Osei handled the operational transition with the particular competence of a woman who had been quietly prepared for it for some time. By close of business, the new authorized signatory documentation was filed, the employee communications had been drafted and reviewed, and a brief, professionally worded notice had gone to every active vendor and counterparty, informing them that Vail Properties had been formally consolidated under its parent holding entity, Hale Dominion Group, and that operations would continue without interruption under new leadership. The new leadership being, as of 9 o'clock that morning, Vivian Hale, She did not go to the headquarters building that day. Edmund had suggested it. A brief appearance, a gesture of stability, and she had declined, because she did not believe that leadership announced itself through gestures, and because there was still significant work to do from Broad Street, and because she had been patient for 3 years and could manage one more afternoon. She left Edmund's office at 6:45. The street was in its early evening arrangement, the light going gold over the rooftops, the city doing what cities do at the end of a day, collecting itself, releasing the particular tension of business hours, resettling into the slightly looser version of itself that comes out after 5. Marcus was at the curb. He held the door, and she got in, and he pulled out into traffic, and the city moved around them, and Vivian sat with her portfolio in her lap and her father's watch on her wrist, and looked out at streets she had known her entire life. Her phone rang. She looked at the screen. It was a number she didn't recognize, which turned out to be Priya Voss's personal cell. She had sourced Vivian's contact through a mutual acquaintance and was calling with notable directness to request a comment for a follow-up piece she was planning for the morning edition. Vivian listened to the message twice. Then she called Edmund and asked him to draft a single paragraph in her name. Factual, precise, no unnecessary color. Something that confirmed the transition, noted the legal integrity of the structure, and said nothing about Nathaniel, because there was nothing about Nathaniel that required her comment. She had already said what needed to be said on a sidewalk on Broad Street that morning. The rest would say itself. The paragraph Edmund drafted ran in Priya Voss's follow-up piece the next morning, and it did exactly what Vivian intended, which was to establish in plain and unremarkable language that Hale Dominion Group had resumed direct operational control of its wholly owned commercial portfolio, that all business activities would continue without interruption, and that further inquiries should be directed to the company's communications office. No drama, no personal statement, no reference to the gala, to Nathaniel, to the photograph that was currently being used as the header image on 17 separate news articles across 4 countries. The photograph was the one taken by a staff photographer for the Charleston Business Journal, a young woman named Tessa Huang, who had been positioned near the stage to capture the project unveiling and had instead captured something else entirely. Nathaniel and Scarlett in the moment of the kiss, stage lights full on them, and in the foreground, slightly out of focus but unmistakably present, Vivian Vale in her silver-white gown, hand extended toward a passing tray, champagne glass being set down with a steadiness that the camera had somehow preserved in full. The contrast in the image was what made it travel. The explosive center versus the composed periphery. The man who thought he was making history and the woman who was already somewhere else in her head entirely. Tessa Huang had not expected to become the most widely credited photographer in the country that week. She was 24 years old and had been at the Journal for 11 months. She would later say in an interview that she had simply done what photographers do, which is point the camera at what's actually happening rather than what's supposed to be happening. The image became, very quickly, its own kind of commentary. Nathaniel returned to the Kiowa property on the second day. The island house was his, genuinely, cleanly, without complication, a 5-bedroom cedar and glass structure on a stretch of beach that he had purchased 6 years ago as a personal asset, entirely outside the corporate structure, because even Nathaniel, who had not read the fine print of his own financing agreements with adequate attention, had understood on some level that a man needed something in his own name. He had driven there in his personal car, a car registered to him personally that no frozen account could touch. With a bag he had packed himself in the Harrington Hotel suite because Vivian had not returned to the house and he had not asked her to. He had not called her again after Broad Street. There was, he had concluded, nothing useful in that direction. The Kiowa house was beautiful in the way houses are when you've been looking at them as status symbols for so long that you've stopped seeing them as places. Standing in the kitchen that second morning, in running clothes because he had walked the beach at 5 a.m., because he couldn't sleep and needed to be moving, Nathaniel looked at the high ceilings and the windows and the Atlantic out past the dunes and felt, for the first time in a long time, the specific smallness of a man standing in a big space that he did not quite fill. Vance Patterson had called it 8. "I've completed the full asset review," Patterson said. The careful, leveled voice was the same as the day before, which Nathaniel found simultaneously reassuring and maddening. Personal accounts total approximately $4.2 million across 3 institutions. The Kiowa property is valued at approximately 3.8. You have a personal investment portfolio, separate from anything corporate, of roughly 1.1. There are 2 personal vehicles, and your Palmetto Club membership, which is non-transferable but has social value. 8 million, Nathaniel said. Give or take. Approximately, yes. He had been worth, by any public account, somewhere between $300 and $400 million 2 weeks ago. The gap between those 2 numbers was not something his mind could traverse in a single step. He kept trying and kept arriving at the same edge. And there's nothing. He stopped. Vance, the Meridian Project. My name is on every piece of press for that development. The City Council approved the variance based on my presentation. There has to be some claim based on... I've spent the last 18 hours looking for it, Patterson said. The issue is the corporate structure. Your role was CEO. CEO, compensation, and title don't convey ownership. The company Vivian's counsel has been meticulous. Every instrument, every filing, every resolution. There is no seam in this, Nathaniel. I am sorry. Nathaniel sat down at the kitchen table. He had a cup of coffee in front of him that had gone cold while he walked the beach. He pulled it toward him and looked at it without drinking it. What about the gala? He said. The public announcement. I made representations to investors based on my authority as CEO of an entity you didn't own, Patterson said, gently but without softening it further. Which makes any representations you made accurate in the sense that you were authorized to make them at the time, but which does not create a retroactive ownership claim. A pause. There may be grounds to discuss a severance arrangement with Hale Dominion's counsel. Given the duration and nature of your operational role, it's not unreasonable to... I don't want a severance arrangement, Nathaniel said. The words came out before he had fully decided to say them, which told him something about where his head actually was. Patterson let the silence sit for a respectful moment. That's your call, but I'd ask you to give it 24 hours before you formalize that position. Nathaniel said he would, and ended the call and sat at the kitchen table with the cold coffee and the Atlantic out the window and the specific grinding silence of a man who has built an identity around a single story and is now required to live without it. He was not without resources. $8 million, by any objective accounting, was not poverty. It was a number that a different man in different circumstances would have found more than sufficient. Nathaniel understood this intellectually. The understanding did not help. What he had lost was not only money. That was the part that a financial summary could not capture. He had lost the architecture of himself, the version of Nathaniel Vale that existed in press releases and on guest lists and at the front of rooms where people listened when he spoke. He had lost the name above the door, the certainty of being the kind of man other men called a visionary, the specific gravity that 12 years of occupying the center of Charleston's business community had built into his posture and his voice and the way he entered a room expecting it to arrange itself around him. That version of Nathaniel Vale was gone. It had been gone since Tuesday. By Thursday, it had been replaced, in the public consciousness, with a different version. A version that Priya Voss's pieces and their 1,600 downstream articles had assembled with the particular ruthlessness of a story that writes itself. He was, in the public telling, the man who hadn't read his own contracts, the man who had celebrated achievements underwritten by a wife he had publicly humiliated. The man who had kissed his mistress on a stage at an event funded by money he didn't own, in a building his name had never legitimately been on, in front of an empire that had always been, someone else's. The story did not require embellishment. That was the thing about it. It was true, and it was complete, and it had been assembled from public documents by a journalist who was very good at her job, and there was nothing in it that could be corrected or contextually reframed because the facts were simply the facts. Nathaniel's phone had been ringing since Tuesday morning, and not always with the calls he wanted. 3 investment partners had requested formal status meetings. 2 had not requested meetings but had sent their attorneys letters. The Southeast Commercial Real Estate Association, which had featured Nathaniel as a keynote speaker at its annual conference 2 years running, had quietly removed his biography from the upcoming program. His listing in the Business Journal's annual Power List, which had included him for 8 consecutive years, was, according to a contact at the publication, under internal review. These things arrived in pieces over the course of the week, each one individually manageable, collectively devastating, the way erosion works. The worst call came on Friday afternoon. Warren Cass was 67, white-haired, a third-generation Charleston developer who had been one of Nathaniel's earliest professional mentors and who had, over the years, been a quiet and consistent advocate in rooms Nathaniel hadn't always been invited into. They had known each other for 15 years. Warren had attended the gala. He had been standing near the windows when the kiss happened and had, according to someone who was watching him, turned away before it was finished. He called at 4 o'clock on Friday without preamble. "I've been thinking about what to say for 3 days," Warren said. His voice was its usual deliberate self, the voice of a man who has chosen his words carefully for 67 years and considers impatience a form of sloppiness. "I haven't been able to come up with a version that's both honest and easy, so I'm going to go with honest." "All right," Nathaniel said. "You had something real," Warren said. "The operating ability, the deal instinct. That was genuine. Nobody gave you that part. But you confused being good at the job with owning the enterprise, and somewhere along the way, that confusion became the whole story you were telling yourself." A pause. "The other thing, the way Tuesday went, that I have less to say about because it's not mine to judge and I'm too old to pretend I don't have my own history with bad decisions. But the combination of the two has done you serious damage, and I don't think you should be alone on that island right now." Nathaniel was quiet. "I'm not calling to pile on," Warren continued. "Boyshade, Warren, I'm calling because I've watched men not survive this kind of thing, and I've watched some of them survive it, and the difference was rarely what they had in the bank, and almost always what they decided to do with the first few months after the fall. There's still something on the other side of this for you, but it won't look like what you had, and the sooner you accept that, the sooner you can figure out what it actually is." "I don't know what to do with that, Warren." "I know you don't. That's okay. You don't have to know yet." Another pause. "Call me in a week. Come have dinner. Bring nothing to prove." The line went quiet. Nathaniel held the phone and looked at the beach and thought about the word survive and what it meant when applied to a life rather than a body. Scarlett Royce's situation moved faster and hit harder. The statement her attorney issued on the second day had not been sufficient armor, as attorneys sometimes privately know when they draft them. The documentation that Hale Dominion Group's legal team provided to the relevant financial oversight authorities, quietly, through proper channels, without press fanfare, told a story that Scarlett's attorney had not seen in full before advising her to issue that statement, and might have chosen differently if he had. The story was this: in the 14 months of her employment with Vail Properties, Scarlett had submitted and received reimbursement for expenses that, upon examination, bore a pattern inconsistent with legitimate business activity. Client entertainment charges at venues that cross-referenced with Nathaniel's personal schedule. Travel expenses to properties that were not on the company's active acquisition list. A series of vendor payments to a consulting firm that, upon registration check, had been incorporated 4 months after Scarlett's hiring date and listed a residential address in a building where she held a lease. Individually, some of these could have been explained. Together, they formed a picture that a forensic accountant could read in approximately 2 hours, which was roughly how long it had taken Hale Dominion's internal team to compile the summary that went to the oversight authorities on Thursday afternoon. The oversight inquiry was not announced publicly. It didn't need to be. Charleston's financial community was not large, and the people who needed to know about it knew about it within 24 hours, which was long enough for Scarlett's status at every institution she had cultivated a professional relationship with over the past 3 years to shift from asset to liability in the specific, quiet, and irreversible way that these things shift when the underlying story changes. She found out about the inquiry from her attorney on Friday morning. She was at her apartment, not the company-subsidized one, which had been rescinded with her employment termination notice on Wednesday, but her personal place in the Ansonboro neighborhood that she had kept throughout the affair, because Scarlett had always understood, on some practical level beneath the ambition, the importance of keeping something that was entirely your own. She had been handling the transition of her personal affairs with the focused efficiency of a woman who is very good under pressure, which she was. She had already reached out to 3 firms in Atlanta and 2 in Charlotte. She had already updated her professional profiles. She had already begun the process of constructing the narrative of her departure. An amicable separation, differences in vision, a desire to pursue opportunities that aligned with her strategic expertise. The call from her attorney dismantled that narrative in 11 minutes. "How bad is it?" she asked when he had finished. He was quiet for a moment. He was a good attorney and prided himself on precision, but there are questions that precision alone cannot answer usefully. "The amounts are in the range of what the authorities typically pursue formally," he said. "The pattern is clear. Their documentation is thorough." "I didn't—" She stopped. Then, "Some of those expenses were authorized. Nathaniel knew about—" "I need you to stop talking and listen to me," her attorney said, with a firmness she hadn't heard from him before. "Whatever Nathaniel knew or didn't know, he is not currently in a position to be a useful witness on your behalf. And the authorization chain, such as it is, runs through an entity that no longer exists in the form it existed when the authorizations were given, which means we are going to need to approach this very carefully." She put the phone down after the call and sat in her apartment in the Ansonborough neighborhood, which was a nice apartment in a nice building with good light in the mornings, and she thought about the last 14 months, not with regret. Regret was a luxury she did not currently have the bandwidth for, but with the sharp analytic attention of a woman trying to locate exactly where the calculus had gone wrong. The answer, when she arrived at it, was uncomfortable in its simplicity. She had looked at Nathaniel Vale and seen a man who owned an empire, and she had structured 14 months of decisions around that assessment, and the assessment had been wrong. The empire had not been his. The authority she had relied on, the access she had leveraged, the arrangements she had made in the confident assumption that she was operating within the orbit of a man with unlimited resources and correspondingly unlimited protection. All of it had been built on a foundation she had not examined because she had not thought to examine it, because nobody told her to look. Nobody except, Scarlett thought, and she had the honesty to complete the thought even if she would never say it aloud. The woman who had been in that ballroom on a Tuesday night in a silver-white gown, watching everything, saying nothing, setting down a champagne glass with the steady hand of someone who has already been 3 steps ahead for a very long time. The public did not process the story in a single news cycle. It expanded. By the end of the first week, the Vivian Hale narrative had outgrown the society page in the business section and was being discussed in contexts that neither she nor Edmund had anticipated, not because the story was inflated, but because it touched something that resonated in ways that a straightforward corporate governance story ordinarily doesn't. The image of a woman who had been background for 12 years turning out to have been the actual foundation of everything her husband celebrated struck people, particularly women of a certain age and life experience, as something beyond a cautionary tale or a revenge fantasy. It struck them as a particular kind of truth about how power actually distributes itself, invisibly, in the spaces between the people who take credit and the people who make things possible. The letters to Priya Voss's editor ran 6-1 in Vivian's favor. The social media commentary, which Vivian did not read and had instructed the Hale Dominion communications team to monitor without escalating to her, was voluminous and largely supportive, and occasionally so personal in its identification with the details of Vivian's experience that it made the communications team uncomfortable in a way they couldn't entirely articulate. Vivian did not give interviews. She issued the one paragraph through Edmund, and then nothing. Her silence was not strategic exactly, or not only strategic. She had simply said what she had to say in the structure itself, in the documents and the filings and the transition notices, and the rest did not require her participation. She went to the headquarters building for the first time on Monday of the second week. It was not a dramatic entrance. She arrived at 7:40, which was before most of the staff, and took the executive elevator with Harriet Osei and Edmund and her own small portfolio and nothing else. The executive floor was clean and orderly and smelled of the same cleaning product it had smelled of for years. The offices were the same offices. The conference rooms were the same conference rooms. The nameplate beside the main entrance to the CEO's suite, which had read Nathaniel Vale in the same brushed steel lettering since the building was fitted out, had been removed. The space where it had been was a slightly cleaner rectangle on the wall. The paint around it fractionally faded. Vivian looked at it briefly and did not comment. Her office, she had chosen a different room, smaller than the CEO suite, one that looked east toward the water rather than west toward the city, was already set up the way she had asked. Desk, 2 chairs, a work table, her father's photograph in a plain frame on the credenza. Nothing else. She did not need the corner office. She did not need the room to announce her. The staff meeting was at 9, the full executive team assembled in the main conference room. 12 people around the table, most of whom had been there through the previous administration, most of whom were watching her with the careful attention of people whose professional lives are in transition and who have not yet determined whether the transition is safe. She looked at them for a moment before she started. She had met most of them before, some briefly, some over multiple years, in the particular background way that she had met most of the people in Nathaniel's professional world, which was from a distance and without much formal acknowledgement of her own understanding of the business. "I know the last week has been disorienting," she said. "I'm not going to pretend otherwise. You came to work for a company with a specific leadership structure, and that structure has changed, and change of this kind is unsettling regardless of the circumstances." She paused. "What I can tell you is that the business is sound. The operational pipeline is intact. The Meridian development proceeds. Every active project continues under existing teams with existing timelines, and there will be no workforce reductions associated with this transition." A visible settling around the table. "What will change," she continued, "is how we talk about what we're building. I want to spend some time with each of you individually over the next 2 weeks, not to evaluate, not to restructure, just to hear your view of what's working and what isn't. I've been watching this company for a long time from the outside, and outside views are useful, but they're incomplete. You have information I need." The CFO, a careful man named Douglas Park, who had been at the company for 4 years and had sat through the original gala presentation with the expression of someone doing mental arithmetic throughout, raised his hand with a precision that suggested he had been holding the question since Monday. "Mrs. Hale," he said, "the Meridian, the press has been... Some of the coverage has focused on the origin of the financing rather than the project itself. Are we expecting any fallout with the city council? The variance was approved under the current ownership structure," Vivian said, "which has not changed. The variance was issued to an entity controlled by Hale Dominion Group. The operating team that executed the application is the same team sitting in this room. The project approval is not affected." She kept her eyes on him. "But you're right that there's a conversation to be had with the council, and I've already requested a meeting with Foster Aldridge for Thursday. I want him to hear about the project's direction from me directly, not from the press." Douglas Park nodded and wrote something down. The rest of the meeting was substantive and specific, and by the time it ended at 10:40, had the texture of a meeting in which actual work was getting done rather than one in which people were performing stability for the benefit of a new authority. Vivian noticed the difference and filed it. Harriet Osei stayed after the others left. She was 51, with a precise intelligence that showed in the economy of her language and the quality of her preparation, and she had been at Hale Dominion Group for 19 years, longer than most of the people in that room had known the company existed. She had run the operational finances of the entire holding structure through 2 recessions, a credit crisis, and the particular complexities of having a publicly invisible beneficial owner, and she had done all of it without complaint and without significant external recognition, which was a fact that Vivian had always been aware of and had considered every time she had wondered what invisible competence looked like up close. "Douglas will be fine," Harriet said, once the room was cleared. "He's careful rather than political. He'll follow the structure wherever it goes, as long as the structure is sound." "And is it sound?" Harriet gave her a look that said she would not have been sitting here if it weren't. "We have 12 active projects. 6 are in construction phase, 4 are in the planning and permitting phase, 2 are in final presale. Cash position is healthy. The credit facilities are intact. The lenders were notified, as you know, and 3 of the 4 have already confirmed continuation under the new signatory structure. The 4th," she consulted her notebook, "First Coastal is asking for a face-to-face meeting before they formalize the continuation. They want to assess." "When?" "They're flexible, this week or next." "Schedule it for Wednesday," Vivian said. "I'll go myself." Harriet wrote it down. "There's one other thing." She paused with this air of someone who has been deciding how to raise the subject. "The Meridian project. The original scope was, as you know, primarily residential and commercial luxury. High-end condominiums, premium retail, corporate office floors. The financing model assumed a specific price point market. She stopped again. There has been, since the coverage, a significant amount of public commentary about the nature of the development and what it will mean for the neighborhoods it borders. Some of it is organized. There's a coalition of community groups who've been outside the construction site twice this week. Vivian was quiet for a moment. She had known this would come. She had, in fact, been thinking about it since before the transition, since the night 2 years ago when she had been at a foundation event and listened to a housing advocate named Carla Sims describe, in the particular flat language of someone who has said a thing many times and has stopped hoping it will land differently, the displacement pattern that large-scale luxury development had produced in 3 adjacent neighborhoods over the previous decade. Vivian had sat with Carla's words on the drive home and had thought about her father and the way he had talked about what buildings were for, which was not what most developers talked about. "What's the status of the affordable housing set aside in the current plan?" she asked. Harriet's expression shifted slightly. 12% of residential units, which meets the variance requirement by 2 percentage points. What would it take to get it to 30? Harriet looked at her. The financing model would need to be restructured. The luxury unit economics subsidize the lower-priced unit, so increasing the set-aside proportion reduces the margin. Depending on how we structure it, you're looking at a reduction in projected return of somewhere between 18 and 24% over the project timeline. Vivian thought about the renderings on the screens at the gala, the towers, the promenade, the press coverage that had described the project as Nathaniel's vision for a new Charleston, which was the kind of description that assumed the city's past residents were a backdrop rather than stakeholders. "Get me the restructured model by end of week," she said, "and find out who's leading the community coalition. I want a meeting with them before the council meeting Thursday." Harriet wrote it down without visible reaction, which was the reaction of a woman who has been doing this long enough to know that the biggest decisions often look the smallest in the moment they're made. "One more thing," Vivian said. She had been holding it, not because it was difficult, but because it was the kind of thing that should come last, after the business. "The building name." "Yes?" "The lobby directory still has the old lettering placeholder. We need to make a decision about what goes there." She looked at the windows, the harbor visible past the construction cranes, the city arranging itself in the middle morning light. "I want the company name changed to Hale Innovations, formally with the state registry. And I want the building to carry the family name, not mine personally. Just Hale." She paused. "My father didn't put his name on things for decoration. He put it on things that earned it." Harriet looked at her for a moment with an expression that was the closest she had come in 19 years of working for the Hale family to something personal. "I'll have the paperwork drafted today," she said. Nathaniel was not at the Kiowa house when the rebranding was announced. He had returned to Charleston because the isolation had proven, after 10 days, to be less clarifying than he had hoped and more corrosive than he had expected, and because Warren Cass had called again, and this time Nathaniel had accepted the dinner invitation and driven back to the city and sat across a table from an old man who asked him nothing about the empire and everything about what he had actually wanted from his life before the empire became the whole of it. He had not answered the question well, which Warren had taken as progress of a kind. He was staying in a rented apartment on the east side, nothing dramatic, a clean 2-bedroom in a building without a doorman, the kind of place that required him to carry his own groceries, which was a smaller thing than it sounds, and a larger adjustment than he expected. He had driven past the headquarters building twice without stopping, both times at night, as though the building meant something different after dark, as though proximity without entry was a form of processing. The name change went up on a Tuesday. He didn't see it in person. He saw it in a photograph in the business journal, the new lettering clean and spare against the building's glass entrance. Hale Innovations. No ceremony, apparently. No press event. The journal piece was 3 paragraphs, matter of fact, noting the rebranding and the formal corporate restructuring and a quote from Edmund Mercer about the company's commitment to its existing projects and partnerships. Nathaniel read the 3 paragraphs twice. Then he set his phone face down on the rented apartment's kitchen counter and stood in the small kitchen and looked out the window at a street that had nothing to do with him. His credit cards worked. His personal accounts were intact. The Kiowa property was on the market because $8 million was enough to live on and to start something small with, but it was not enough to maintain a beach house and an urban rental and a life structured around the scale of what he had previously occupied. And Vance Patterson had, with characteristic precision, advised him that the Kiowa sale was financially rational and that the net proceeds would provide a meaningful cushion. He had authorized the listing on Friday. The property had 3 showings scheduled for the following week. Scarlett was not reachable. He had tried twice in the first week, not out of sentiment or not only, but because there were practical questions that intersected with her situation and his, and because a part of him had believed, briefly and without much foundation, that the experience of mutual ruin might produce some form of honest conversation between them. Her attorney had responded to both attempts with polite letters, noting that his client was not available for direct communication and that all matters should go through counsel. He had not tried a third time. He thought about Vivian regularly, not with anger anymore, or not primarily with anger. The anger had burned through its fuel in the first week and left something behind that was harder to name. Part of it was the specific shame of a man who has understood, belatedly and fully, what he had done to a person who had, for 12 years, treated him with more respect than he had earned. Part of it was the grinding cognitive work of reconstructing a past he had understood as his own story, and finding, on reconstruction, that the story was considerably more complicated than he had told it. He had loved her. He had also, gradually and without fully deciding to, stopped seeing her as someone whose interior life required his attention, which is a different kind of not loving, and possibly a worse one. He had treated her as furniture in his own narrative, not cruelly. He had never been consciously cruel, but with the casual indifference of a man who has gotten comfortable with a version of events that doesn't require him to look too closely at certain things. He knew she would not call. He had no standing to call her. He had said what there was to say on Broad Street, which was nothing, because there had been nothing to say that didn't sound like either an excuse or a negotiation, and he had at least had the self-awareness to know it. What remained, after the anger and the shame and the grinding practical work of managing a smaller life than the one he'd had, was a question Warren had asked at dinner that he kept returning to without arriving at an answer. What did you actually want? Before all this was who you were? He had been 29 when he made his first significant deal. He had been excited in a way that was different from the excitement of later deals. Less about scale, more about the thing itself, the specific pleasure of having looked at something broken and figured out how to fix it. A building in a neighborhood nobody was paying attention to. He had spent 6 months on it. He had known every contractor, every permit number, every decision that went into the renovation. He had stood on the finished roof and felt the particular satisfaction of a person who has made something that didn't exist before they decided to make it. He didn't know exactly when that satisfaction had been replaced by the hunger for scale, for the rooms full of people applauding the scale. He suspected it had happened gradually, as most replacements do. The original thing so slowly substituted for the larger version that by the time you notice the exchange, it has been complete for years. He made coffee in the rented apartment's small kitchen and drank it standing up, looking at the street. Somewhere across the city, in a building that now bore her family's name, Vivian Hale was doing the work that had always, in the end, been hers. The Meridian development was moving forward under the restructured plan. He had read about the affordable housing changes in the Business Journal 3 times, because something about the specifics of what she was doing with the project landed differently than he expected. She had taken the thing he had built a public identity around and redirected it toward a purpose he had never discussed, never considered, never had the quietness of mind to arrive at. He thought about what that meant and did not arrive at a comfortable place. His phone buzzed. It was a message from a former colleague in Columbia, a man who ran a mid-size residential development company, asking if Nathaniel would be open to a conversation about a project that needed someone with experience in permitting and community relations. Not a partnership, not a leadership role, a consulting engagement, modest scope, modest compensation. Nathaniel read the message twice. He set the phone down. He picked it up again. He looked at the street and thought about Warren's question and thought about the 29-year-old on the roof of the first building. He typed a reply that said he was open to a conversation and sent it before he could change the sentence into something that sounded larger. It was the most honest professional communication he had sent in a very long time, and somewhere in the fact of it, beneath the diminishment and the loss and the genuine grief of having held something he did not fully own and now could not hold at all, there was something else, small, tentative, and not yet named, that he had not felt in years. He recognized it eventually, standing in a rented kitchen with a coffee that had gone lukewarm. It was the feeling of starting from what was actually true. The divorce was finalized on a Thursday in February, 4 months after the gala. There was no courtroom drama, no contested hearing, no warring attorneys staging their arguments for a judge who had seen all of it before. Edmund and Vance Patterson had negotiated the settlement through 3 rounds of correspondence that were, by all accounts, professionally civil in the way that communications are civil, when both sides understand the mathematics and neither side has grounds to dispute them. Nathaniel kept the Kiowa property proceeds, which had closed in January, at $3.6 million. He kept his personal accounts, his investment portfolio, the 2 cars. He kept his name, which was worth less in the market than it had been 4 months ago, but was still his, and still attached to a genuine operational history that, stripped of its false ownership narrative, remained real. Vivian kept everything else. She signed the final documents in Edmund's office on Broad Street, at the same long table where she had signed the activation protocol 4 months earlier, in the same chair with the same pen that Edmund kept in the same place on the same credenza, because Edmund Mercer was a man of fixed habits and saw no reason to apologize for it. She signed 8 pages in sequence, initialed 3 others, and when it was done, she set the pen down and sat for a moment without speaking. Edmund did not fill the silence. He had known her long enough to understand when silence was processing, and when it was grief, and when it was neither, when it was simply a person taking the weight of a completed thing and letting the full dimension of its completion settle into its proper place. This was the third kind. "Your father would have been proud of how you handled this," he said finally. He said it simply, without ornament, because it was true, and because she deserved to hear it, and because Edmund, who was not a sentimental man, occasionally allowed himself to say the true thing plainly rather than economically. Vivian looked at the signed documents. "He would have told me I took too long." "He would have told you that you took exactly as long as it required," Edmund said, which is what he always meant when he said that. She almost smiled. It was a small, specific expression, not the social smile she had deployed 1,000 times in 1,000 ballrooms, but the private one, the one that had been getting more use in the last few months. "Probably." She stood and picked up her portfolio and the leather bag she'd carried since her 20s, which had a broken clasp on the inner pocket that she had never gotten around to repairing and probably never would, because at some point an object becomes more itself precisely because of the things wrong with it. She said goodbye to Claire at the front desk, who had ordered in lunch for the whole office in what was clearly an unofficial acknowledgement of the occasion, and walked out onto Broad Street into a February morning that was cold and clear and smelled of the harbor. She stood on the sidewalk for a moment. The street was the same street. The building behind her was the same building. The city around her was the same city it had always been, which was also, she had come to understand, not entirely true. Cities change the way people change, slowly and then all at once. And the Charleston she was standing in now was not precisely the one she had grown up in. And she was not precisely the person she had been when she came to understand what she was going to have to do. She was better in some ways, harder in some ways, and she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge that hardness as a real thing rather than reframing it as strength, because there is a difference, and she had spent enough years watching people confuse the two. She was also, in ways she had not fully anticipated, freer. Not in the dramatic, cinematic sense of a woman throwing her arms open to a new day. That was not her, and had never been her. But in the quieter, more durable sense of a person whose energy is no longer divided between the life she is living and the life she is managing in parallel, in secret, at considerable cost. She walked to the car. Marcus was there. She got in. "Hale Innovations?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "But stop at Poogan's first. I want coffee, and I haven't eaten since 6. Marcus adjusted course without comment, which was one of the things she valued most about him. The company, in those first 4 months, had surprised her. Not the work itself. She had understood the work, in its broad architecture, for years. What surprised her was the texture of it up close. The particular quality of the problems that landed on her desk, which were almost never the clean strategic decisions she had imagined from the outside, and almost always the accumulated friction of a dozen smaller decisions that had been made without enough information or with the wrong incentives, or simply with the ordinary human error of someone who was tired and under-resourced and doing their best anyway. She had expected to find an organization that had been managed for spectacle, and she had, but she had also found beneath the spectacle, in the actual operational machinery, people who were genuinely good at their work and had been quietly good at it without much acknowledgement. Douglas Park, the CFO, had turned out to be the most valuable person in the building, which he had probably always been and which Nathaniel had probably never told him. He was meticulous and cautious and occasionally infuriating in his insistence on modeling every scenario before committing to a direction, and he was almost always right. Vivian had told him, in their second one-on-one meeting, that she intended to restructure the executive compensation framework to better reflect actual contribution to company performance rather than seniority and title proximity to the CEO, and he had looked at her with the expression of a man receiving confirmation of something he had stopped hoping for. I appreciate that, he said, in the way people say things when they mean considerably more than the words. Don't thank me. It's just accurate, she said. How long have you been here? 4 years? And in those 4 years, how many times did you have a financial concern escalated and then overridden for presentation reasons? He paused. Frequently. I need you to tell me when something is wrong, she said. Not after it's been smoothed over. When it's wrong. He had been telling her since that conversation, and she had been listening, and the quality of her decisions had benefited from it in ways that were visible in the quarterly numbers and invisible in the way that good collaboration is usually invisible. It just looks from the outside like things going reasonably well. Harriet Osei had taken on an expanded operational role without being asked, which was characteristic. She had also, in late November, brought Vivian a piece of information she had been sitting on for a week, while deciding whether it was her place to share it. There's a woman, Harriet said, setting a folder on Vivian's desk with the air of someone completing an action they've already fully committed to. Carla Sims. She's been coordinating the community coalition around the Meridian site. I've been in 3 working sessions with her and her group about the affordable housing restructure and the public amenities plan. Harriet paused, choosing the word. She's not what I expected. Vivian opened the folder. A brief bio, notes from the working sessions, a photograph from a community meeting. Carla Sims was 53, with a direct, unguarded expression in the photograph that matched what Vivian remembered from the foundation event 2 years earlier. The woman with the flat language and the housing statistics that had been impossible to argue with. She's been doing this work for 15 years, Harriet said. Neighborhood advocacy, displacement research, community land trust development. She has a master's in urban planning from Georgia Tech. She's also, and I want to be straight with you about this, she has been publicly critical of this company for the last 2 years, and some of what she's said has been accurate. Vivian looked up from the folder. What do you want to suggest? Harriet was quiet for a moment. I want to suggest that the community engagement model for the Meridian isn't working well enough, and that the person who could make it work better is currently on the other side of the table from us. And I think you should meet with her one-on-one, not in a working session, just the 2 of you. Vivian considered this. She looked at the photograph again. Set it up. The meeting had been at a coffee shop in the Wagner Terrace neighborhood, not Vivian's choice and not Hale Innovations territory, which was deliberate on Carla's part and which Vivian respected. Carla arrived 5 minutes early and was already at a corner table with a large coffee and a notepad when Vivian came in, and she looked at Vivian with the frank, appraising attention of a person who has been doing advocacy work long enough to know that the quality of a meeting is usually determined in the first 2 minutes. I want to be clear about something before we start, Carla said when Vivian sat down. I'm not here because your company changed its leadership structure. I'm here because the restructured housing plan is substantially better than what we've been fighting against for 2 years, and because the people I represent deserve to have someone at this table who is paying attention to what they actually need, not to what looks good in a press release. I understand, Vivian said. I'm also here, Carla continued, Because Harriet Osei told me you wanted to hear directly from community members rather than through a consultant summary, which is either a real thing or a performance, and I don't have time for performances." "It's a real thing," Vivian said. Carla looked at her for a moment. Then she picked up her coffee and got to work. They met 4 times over the following 6 weeks. By the 3rd meeting, they were past the formal presentation stage and into the genuine conversation, the one where both sides bring their actual concerns rather than their negotiating positions. And Vivian had learned more about the specific, granular human cost of the development pattern she had been financing for 12 years than she had known before, which was not an easy thing to learn and which she did not try to make comfortable by reframing. By the 4th meetings, they had agreed on a community advisory structure for the Meridian project that gave the coalition formal input on public space design, tenant selection for the affordable units, and the ongoing management standards for the mixed-income residential floors. It was not everything Carla had asked for in year 1. It was more than Carla had expected to get, and she was honest about that. "I'm still watching," Carla said at the end of the last meeting. "This is a commitment, not a press release. And the difference between those two things shows up in implementation, not in what gets announced." "I know," Vivian said. "Watch. That's exactly what I want you to do." Carla looked at her with an expression that wasn't quite trust and wasn't quite skepticism. It was something in between, the specific expression of a person who has been let down enough times to be careful about hope, but has enough experience to recognize the difference between performance and intention. "Okay?" she said simply. It was, Vivian thought, the most honest professional endorsement she had received since taking the company. The Meridian groundbreaking ceremony took place on a Friday in March, 5 months after the gala that had broken the other kind of ground entirely. It was a small event by the standards of what the original announcement had been. No 500 guests, no 3-screen presentation, no stage lighting designed to create the impression of historic magnitude. A tent on the construction site, folding chairs, representatives from the city council and the community coalition and the construction and design teams. Priya Voss was there, with a photographer, because she had been covering the story from the beginning and at this point considered herself in a particular relationship with it that went beyond a standard assignment. Foster Aldridge spoke first, briefly and warmly, about the council's support for the revised plan and the way the community engagement process had produced a better project than the original vision. He said this in the specific language of a politician who means what he's saying and knows how unusual that is, and the audience seemed to understand the distinction. Carla Sims spoke second. She talked about the families on the wait list for the affordable units, which numbered over 200. She talked about a woman named Dorothy who was 71 and had lived in the adjacent neighborhood for 40 years and had watched 3 buildings she'd lived in converted to luxury properties and had told Carla, when the revised Meridian plan was announced, that she didn't believe it yet, but she was going to believe it when she had keys in her hand. Carla said she intended to be there when Dorothy got those keys and looked at Vivian when she said it. Vivian spoke last and briefly. She had written and thrown away 3 drafts of remarks over the preceding week, each of which had been too much of something. Too formal, too personal, too explanatory. What she said in the end was less than 2 minutes and had been arrived at, as the best things sometimes are, by removing everything that was there to impress and keeping only what was true. She said that her father had built this company on a principle she had come to understand only gradually, which was that buildings are not achievements, they are obligations. An obligation to the people who will live in them, work in them, walk past them, and inherit them. She said that she had spent several years watching the company she owned operate in ways that violated that principle, and that she accepted her share of responsibility for allowing that to continue as long as it did. She said that the Meridian project, in its revised form, was the company's first real attempt to build something that would outlast its own press coverage. She did not say anything about Nathaniel. She did not say anything about the gala, or the corporate transition, or the story that had been in the papers for 5 months. Those things were true and were part of how she had arrived here, but they were not the story she wanted this day to tell. She picked up a ceremonial shovel and broke ground, and the audience applauded, and Priya Voss's photographer took the picture, and the city of Charleston continued its ordinary Friday around them, indifferent and enduring in the way cities are. Edmund found her afterward, near the edge of the tent, where the harbor was visible past the construction barrier. He was in his usual dark coat, holding a coffee he had obtained from somewhere, characteristically prepared. "Well done," he said. "It's just the beginning," she said. "The beginning is the hard part." She looked out at the water. The crane stood against a gray March sky. Somewhere in that framework of steel and concrete was the shape of a building that did not yet exist, that would take 2 more years to become the thing she had agreed it should be, and which would require 100 decisions she hadn't made yet, and which would inevitably fall short of what she hoped and exceed what she feared, in the irregular way that real things always do. "My father never came to groundbreaking," she said. Edmund thought about this. He said they were celebrations of things that hadn't happened yet. He said they were occasions for vanity, Vivian corrected. He didn't trust them. She paused. He came to openings, the day a thing was done and people could walk into it. That's what he thought deserved a ceremony. "He would have come to this one," Edmund said. She looked at him. It was a more openly emotional statement than Edmund typically made, and she received it the same way she received all of Edmund's occasional direct things, without deflecting, without dismissing, letting it mean what it meant. "Maybe," she said. She stayed until the tent was struck and the chairs were folded and the construction crew returned to work. She had a site meeting at 2 and a lender call at 4 and a board preparation session at 6 that she had already pushed once and couldn't push again. The work did not pause for ceremony, which was, she had found, one of the things she genuinely liked about it. The message from Edmund came in April, on a Tuesday morning. Vivian was in the glass-walled conference room on the 3rd floor, her preferred room for working mornings, the one with the east-facing windows and the harbor light coming in at the right angle, going through the quarterly report with Douglas and Harriet when Clara knocked and entered. "I'm sorry to interrupt," Clara said. She looked at Vivian with the specific expression she used when something required immediate attention, and she had already made the judgment that it did. "There's a communication request in Mr. Mercer's inbox that he thought you should know about." "From?" "From a sales representative for a company called Metro Food Supply Group." Clara paused. "The representative's name is Nathaniel Vale." The conference room was quiet for a moment. Douglas Park found something extremely interesting in the quarterly report. Harriet O'Say looked at the harbor with the expression of a woman who is very deliberately not reacting. Vivian set down her pen. "What is he selling?" "Restaurant and catering supplies, according to the inquiry. He's requesting a meeting with your facilities procurement team about a potential vendor relationship." She thought about this for a moment. Not for long. She had in some form imagined a version of this conversation before, had considered what she would feel and what she would do, and had arrived at a position that felt, when she tested it, like the right one. Not the satisfying one, necessarily. The right one. "Send a reply through Edmund's office," she said. "Tell Mr. Vale that Hale Innovations appreciates his inquiry and that all vendor communications must go through the formal procurement portal. The contact information is on the company website." She paused. "And that the portal review cycle is approximately 60 days. Clara wrote it down. "Also tell him," Vivian said, and stopped. Clara waited. "That's all," Vivian said. "Just the portal." Clara nodded and left. Douglas and Harriet returned to the quarterly report with the quiet professionalism of people who understand that some moments are not theirs to inhabit. Vivian looked at the harbor for a moment. The water was the particular flat silver of an April morning before the sun has fully committed. The cranes at the Meridian site were already moving. Somewhere in that building's bones was Dorothy's apartment, not yet built, not yet real, and 143 others, and the public park along the waterfront edge, and the education center on the ground floor that Carla's coalition had pushed for and won, and all of it was still in the future and therefore still possible. She picked up her pen. "Where were we?" she said. Douglas found the page. They continued. She thought about Nathaniel that evening, driving home. Not in the consuming, recurring way she had once thought about things she could not resolve. This was different, quieter. More like memory than wound. She thought about the man she had married, who had been, for a specific and real period of time, someone she had loved with the full weight of who she was. She thought about this gradual, undramatic way that love had changed. Not broken in a single moment, but worn through over years of small inattentions, small dismissals, the accumulated message of being treated as peripheral to the life of a person she had never been peripheral to. She thought about the night in the car after the foundation gala, the harbor lights, the text from Edmund. She thought about this decision she had made that night, which was not a new decision. The decision had been made months before, but the moment when she had felt it settle into a kind of peace. She did not think Nathaniel was a bad man. She had never thought that. He was a man with specific and serious flaws. Vanity, self-deception, the particular blindness of someone whose gifts have always been sufficient to avoid real reckoning. And she had loved him anyway, and had watched those flaws grow larger in the shelter of unchallenged success. And she had reached a point where love and honesty could not coexist, because the honest thing was to stop enabling a structure that was bad for both of them. The kiss at the gala had not been the cause of what happened. She knew that. It had been the occasion, the moment she had been, in some form, waiting for. The event that gave the structure of what she had built a clean and undeniable reason to activate. If it hadn't been that, it would have been something else, because the something else had been accumulating for years and was always going to arrive. She had simply been prepared for it. She was not glad about the way it had gone, precisely. She was not one of the people in the comment sections who had used the word destroyed with evident satisfaction, who had described Nathaniel's fall in the language of deserving and getting what was coming. That was other people's story, and she did not share it. What had happened to Nathaniel was real, and some of it was the natural consequence of his own decisions, and some of it was the consequence of hers. And she sat with that complexity without trying to simplify it into either guilt or vindication, because it was both and neither and more complicated than either word could hold. She had not ruined him. She had removed him from something that had never been his. There was a difference, and she had always understood it, and she hoped, she genuinely hoped, in the complicated way that is the only honest kind, that he would eventually understand it too. The spring came, and with it the particular transformation that Charleston performs every year, whether the city's inhabitants are paying attention or not. The azaleas along the Battery, the live oaks in their new green, the harbor bright and busy with boat traffic, and the smell of the water that had nothing to do with anyone's plans or failures or triumphs, and everything to do with the fact that it was April and the city was alive. Vivian had started walking to work 3 days a week. The distance from the house that was now simply the house, no longer the house she shared or the house she had stayed in too long out of inertia, just her house, was 20 minutes at a reasonable pace, through streets she had known her entire life that managed, most mornings, to feel at least partially new. She walked past the church on Rutledge where her parents had been married, past the coffee shop on Montague where she'd had lunch with Edmund and set a final sequence in motion, past the turning where Broad Street began, where the buildings got older and more serious, and the city revealed its own skeleton through the brick. The Hale Innovations building was visible from 2 blocks away on clear mornings, the glass catching the early light in a way that the original construction had not anticipated and that Vivian had come to think of as the building doing something on its own that had nothing to do with the architect's intentions. The name was there above the entrance, clean and plain. Hale. No innovations appended on the building face itself. That was for the letterhead and the documents. On the building, just the name. Her father's name, and her grandmother's before that, and further back than that. The name of people she had never met who had lived and worked and built things in this city long before the city thought to celebrate them for it. She stopped at the coffee cart on the corner because she had started doing this in February and it had become a thing. Not a ritual exactly, but a pause. 3 minutes of ordinary transaction. The man's name was Pete. He was 64 and had been running this cart for 9 years. His daughter was studying nursing at MUSC, and he was very proud of her and mentioned it about once a week. Vivian had learned these things not because she was performing community engagement, but because Pete talked to her and she listened, and this had turned out to be worth doing. "Big day?" Pete said, handing her the coffee. "Regular day," she said. "Regular days are the good ones," he said. "They are," she agreed. She crossed the street and walked into her building and took the elevator to the 3rd floor and set her coffee on her desk and opened her laptop and looked at what the day required. There was a lot. There was always a lot. The Meridian construction was in month 6 and had hit a delay in the waterproofing phase that Douglas had flagged on Friday and that required a decision about contractor substitution before the end of the week. The first coastal refinancing was in final review and needed her signature on 3 instruments. There was a message from Carla Sims about a community meeting she was organizing in the Lower Peninsula neighborhood and an invitation for Vivian to attend, not to speak, just to be present, which was a specific and significant distinction. There was a routine board communication and a not quite routine inquiry from a Singapore-based infrastructure fund that had apparently read about Hale Innovations' restructured investment thesis and wanted an introduction call. There was also, at the bottom of her inbox, a note from Priya Voss at the Financial Ledger. No formal interview request this time. They had been through that conversation twice, and Vivian had declined both times. Just a short note saying that she was working on a longer piece about leadership transitions in family-owned holding companies, and that if Vivian ever wanted to talk, off the record, she would find the conversation worth her time. Priya added in a postscript that was more candid than the professional framing of the rest of the note. I think there's a story here that's bigger than what we've been able to tell so far. I think you know that too. Vivian read the postscript twice. She thought about Priya's face in the ballroom, the journalist's particular alertness, the way she had been standing 12 feet away when Vivian set the champagne glass down and walked out. She thought about what a bigger story might mean, and what it might cost, and what it might, if told carefully, be worth. She did not respond that morning. She let it sit in the inbox where things sit when they are not quite ready. There was time. That was the thing she had not always known, and now did. There was time for the things that deserved time, and the urgency that had organized so much of the previous 12 years had been, in large part, someone else's urgency that she had absorbed as her own. Her own pace was different, less spectacular, less driven by the need for witnesses, more durable. She opened the Meridian file and started on the contractor issue, because it was the most immediate thing and it had a real answer, and the answer required her full attention, and she gave it that. At lunchtime, she ate at her desk, which was a habit she had been trying to break and had not fully broken. Clara brought her a sandwich from the place on the corner at 12:30 without being asked, because they had arrived at this arrangement organically, and it worked for both of them. "Your 1 o'clock called to confirm," Clara said, setting the sandwich down. "Who is it?" "The architect, the community park phase." "Good." She looked up from the screen. "Clara, send a reply to Priya Voss. Tell her I'm open to an off-the-record conversation when schedules allow. Tell her I'll be in touch." Clara wrote it down. "Anything else?" Vivian thought about it. "No, that's enough for now." Clara left, and the office settled into its midday quiet. And outside the east-facing windows, the harbor did what it always did. Held the light, moved under the wind, indifferent to the particular concerns of the people who had built their lives along its edge, and who continued to build, generation after generation, the imperfect and necessary things that cities are made of. She ate the sandwich. She thought about Dorothy, who was waiting for her keys. She thought about her father, sitting in his office on a gray January afternoon, watching a 24-year-old woman sign her name to the foundation of something he had built on the quiet faith that she would know what to do with it when the time came. She thought he had been right, mostly. Not completely. She had made mistakes, had been too patient in some ways and too slow in others, had allowed things to continue longer than clean judgment required because grief is not always separable from wisdom. And she had been grieving something for years without a clean name to give it. She was human, which meant she had done all of this imperfectly, and would continue to. But the foundation held. That was what her father had built. Not a monument, not a story, not a name above a door. A foundation. Something that holds the weight of the things built on top of it, invisibly, without credit, without needing to announce itself. She had understood that for years. She understood it more fully now, sitting in this office with the harbor out the window and the city doing its ordinary work around her. The afternoon was waiting. She folded the wax paper from the sandwich, set it aside, and went back to work.